On today's episode of An ADD Woman, I want to talk about this question, this idea. Is it ADHD or did the tooth fairy steal my keys? Welcome to An ADD Woman podcast. I'm your host, Lacy Estelle, writer of all things about ADHD parenting and being an ADHD mother on Mothering the Storm with Lacy Estelle at lacyestelle.com. Here on an ADD Woman podcast, we're going to switch it up and talk about all things to do with ADHD as an adult woman and how we deal with it. Now you might be thinking, ADHD, women don't really have that. Actually, we do. We've all just been doing such a great job for years of masking it. So let's dive in. Let's talk about everything that our ADHD touches in our lives. And when I say everything, I mean everything. There is not one thing when you have ADHD that it doesn't affect. I'm so glad you're here. And if nothing else, I hope that you take away from this that you are not alone, you are not a failure, you are not lazy, and you are not stupid, and you are definitely not crazy. You just have ADHD, and you're just like me. Basically, how do you know whether or not you have ADHD or ADD? Now, I'm not a doctor, and everything that I say in this podcast is not to be taken as medical advice. But I think that it's fair to say that as a diagnosed woman with ADHD, there are some telltale signs that I might be able to help you recognize, basically because I've lived with them. So the American Psychological Association defines ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as a behavioral condition that makes focusing on everyday requests and routines challenging. People with ADHD typically have trouble getting organized, staying focused, making realistic plans, and thinking before acting. Basically, life is pretty hard for us because we are disorganized, we are unrealistic, and we're impulsive. I'd say that that's correct, except for the fact that many ADHDers, along with myself, which you'll find me saying the words ADHDers with the ERS at the end. It's this kind of silly, cool name us people with ADHD call ourselves. Some of us, and I guess myself included, sort of resent the idea that we have an attention deficit. Because the truth of it is, based on several studies, ADHD is less a lack of attention and it's more a lack of regulating that attention. In fact, we tend to pay too close attention to the wrong things and less attention to the correct task at hand, so to speak. Not to say that there is a right or a wrong thing to focus on, because let me tell you, some of the things I've spent my life focusing on, I don't regret those things. Even though at the time it might have grew me or it might have been more beneficial to me to pay attention to, algebra in algebra class. But at the same time, I don't regret taking the time to focus on the things that probably weren't or shouldn't have been as important to me as they were at the time. I would like to give you some example or give you some context for this. So in school and throughout school, I could read really well, in fact. I've found one of the misnomers about ADHD kids is their lack of reading skills, or their assumed lack of reading skills. But as a young girl, I was the exact opposite. I could read entire books, and actually I still can, in 36 to 72 hour increments. The only reason I don't read books that quickly these days is because I have children. I'd say that having children is probably the one thing that having ADHD kind of trumps it. And I don't mean that in the way that my ADHD isn't important or, if I want to read a book really quickly that I couldn't. It's just I'm recording this podcast late at night once all my children are in bed. And that's not because I lack the attention to do so during the day. It's because my kids have questions for me every 5 seconds. And if you have kids, I know you know exactly what I'm talking about. So back to what I was saying. When I was a girl, I definitely could read entire books in 36 to 72 hour increments. I was considered advanced for my age in reading, but I couldn't turn in homework or remember to do it. I could not keep my room picked up. And I know that lots of kids can't keep their room picked up. I hear that all the time. It seems like every other time that I say something like, oh, yeah, well, when I was a kid, I struggled with this. Well, lots of kids struggle with that. Yes, Karen, lots of kids do struggle with that. What I'm trying to say is I struggled to a point to where it did start to affect my life. So I couldn't keep my room picked up. I could not memorize the algebra formulas I needed to know for math. So, my teachers would say, how was it that this clearly bright and smart girl, right? Because I could read at like an 11th grade level when I was in 5th grade, could have ADHD. Clearly, I could read. So my struggle is not with attention. Or is it? I think that one of the most common mistakes I see when it comes to differentiating women with ADHD or girls with ADHD from boys with it is the idea that it looks the same for everyone. Which is funny because we've done enough research to realize that mental health diagnoses like autism or fetal alcohol syndrome are on spectrums. Yet we still assume ADHD means hyperactive, can't sit still, speaks out of turn, and lacks motivation for anything academic related. And for us girls and women, it's simply not the case. I have talked to several women who have said and asked other women who have ADHD, did you find that you liked school, that you liked learning? So because you were able to get A's and B's in school, you got kind of passed up as being ADHD, but yet you were having to work 3 times as hard as your peers to maintain those grades? The majority of society seems to assume that ADHD means hyperactive. Those of us women with ADHD or even with ADD, especially the ADD presentation, which is the primary inattentive type, which is what I am, I could hyper focus on the book I was reading because it would basically short circuit my brain's normal interest engager, which I know I'm using super sciencey terms here, but AKA your prefrontal cortex, in a way that I could just go straight for the hyperdrive. And I know I'm mixing science talk here with like science fiction, but stay with me. The idea is, if I was interested in something, if I liked it, if I found it engaging, my brain would literally, just kind of not really flip a switch, but it would like jumpstart. And all of a sudden, I could focus, but it had to be what I wanted to do. It couldn't just be what I was supposed to do. I'd say most neurotypicals are wired to do the tasks given to them because the reward is the work is finished and that feels good, right? So, like, if you talk to ADHDers, we will tell you we want to do all these things. We want to keep our house clean. We want to keep our car clean. We want to get better grades. It doesn't come natural to us. And it's not in a way that you would think. It's not like we don't purposely ignore the messes in front of us, just so you know, or the fires in front of us. I've met ADHD people who struggle with their finances to a fault. They have eviction problems or they have their power shut off notices, okay? But they also struggle with the idea of it's got to just be something wrong with them. So they can't bring themselves to admit that, maybe they need extra help. And I think that that could be the other problem with us girls. We're in school, we're getting good grades, we're working 3 times as hard as our peers, but we're making good grades, right? And we're enjoying what we're doing. We're not going to open our mouths and say, listen, I'm really struggling and this is really hard for me. And I don't know why it's so hard for me. My dad has a story of my sister crying at the table while she was trying to do math because she just couldn't get it and didn't get it. I don't know whether or not my sister has ADHD. I would kind of assume she might, but she's a rock star who owns her own business and works out for a living because her business is a gym. And so she's probably never going to be one of those women that ever really finds out if she does. But that is like the emotion I felt like I had all through school. I was working so hard for those classes that I wanted to keep A's and B's in. And then I would get a class every once in a while that I just couldn't. I couldn't. I'd get to 5th hour and I was like, my attention is gone and I need to sleep. And I think that also comes down to the way our brains are wired. So ADHD brains are not wired in a way to just see the reward as what we're working towards. We actually, a lot of us, and I'm working on this with my younger son, is that we have processing delays. Our processing delays are basically what teaches us to sequence things together, right? So if we struggle with